Hey everybody. All right, so Marissa and I are back with another video for you in our Cybersecurity Awareness Month Halloween video series. So today we're going to talk about passwords and virtual vampires. So passwords, as you can maybe imagine, are extremely valuable to a hacker. And if you are watching this video, I am specifically talking to you because you are somebody who is on the internet, right? You might not think that you have access to stuff that's super interesting or exciting or valuable, but you do, and a hacker knows that. So passwords are extremely valuable. Part of the reason is that they give virtual vampires a very healthy food supply. And we're using this term, virtual vampires, here to talk about an online threat that basically is just after your username and password. But once they have that username and password combination, these virtual vampires will drink the blood from your organization, which you know is your data and your sensitive information and your bank account info and all of that stuff. It's the lifeblood of any organization. So as you can probably imagine, this is a bit of a problem, especially with online technology that you use every day, because a virtual vampire will have access to a ton of sensitive information that in their hands could really damage your business.
And it's a super spooky way to basically say that password attacks are a real risk for your small business. 1/3 of all breaches in 2019 involved the use of a stolen credential. Wowzers. So as exciting as vampires are, I mean, they've been talked about throughout the years through folklore, movies, and TV. There's a whole bunch of different type of virtual vampires, each with their own way to steal your, I want to say blood, but it's actually to steal your passwords.
All right, so let's talk about 3 of the most common virtual vampires, starting with a true classic, you know, like Dracula or Count Von Count from Sesame Street, who is admittedly not very scary, but that's okay. So, Marissa, can you tell us about virtual vampire number 1, and that is brute force attacks?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of this sort of traditional attack method where the attacker basically makes a multiple attempts at possible combinations until they crack into the account. They use automated software to try to guess as many to make as many guesses as possible, and they'll use things like lists of common passwords and their common combinations in order to get in to access their systems. But it's actually, this vampire is pretty easy to repel, and not with garlic, but actually by restricting the number of logon attempts and then locking out the user after they've exceeded that threshold. As you can imagine with a brute force attack, if you're repeatedly trying to get into an account unsuccessfully, it's most likely a brute force attack. And so if you have this mechanism in place, after a couple of attempts, they'll be locked out of the system and unable to penetrate your forces to drain your blood. But because it's so easily thwarted, hackers have kind of come up with a Dracula 2.0, or as I like to say, these are the more modern vampires that you might find in True Blood. Great HBO series. And they've come up with something called password spraying.
Okay, so we obviously have to ask you the question, what is the difference between brute force attacks and password spraying?
So brute force attacks work by using a bunch of possible passwords to get into that single account. Password spraying actually involves using one password to get into multiple accounts. So they're going to acquire a list of usernames, and then they're going to pick a really popular or kind of more likely password, like a password 1234 to attempt to sign into all 1,000 or so of those accounts at one time. Chances are that something or lots of something are going to light up with access. And then the hacker basically picks the next most common password and goes through and tries them all again. This doesn't trigger the lock, that attempt restriction that we talked about with brute force attacks, as there's kind of this enough time in between password attempts. And then of course, if they're lucky, you know, they can avoid being locked out.
Yeah, all right. So these first two virtual vampires, I think, really highlight how weak passwords put your organization at risk for these attacks. But there is an additional third type of virtual vampire that is a little bit more sneaky. So these first two vampires assume that an attacker doesn't know any of your passwords for any account. But theoretically, let's say what happens if your vampire, this virtual vampire, was able to find one of your passwords that maybe he bought on the dark spider web or the dark web. So hackers know, unfortunately, that password reuse across multiple sites is really common. So cyber criminals will get the username and password for that one account, and then they just start hunting for any other accounts that they think you might have, and then just test and test and test and retest until they get a hit. So this virtual vampire is known as credential surfing. And it's incredibly effective because it uses a known password. And we are creatures of habit, and we are oft to reuse our passwords.
That is so true. And that's why the future is trending towards this kind of idea of passwordless authentication, which is a fancy way or a very buzzy way of saying this. We're adopting modern login technologies like biometric fingerprint scans or your face scan that you're used to on your iPhone. And we're using this to easily access our data without that security risk we have inherently with passwords. Microsoft 365 actually has some options built with Windows 10 for improving security measures beyond passwords. But this isn't going to work with every site that your team may need to log into, nor will it work with every device that you access it from. So there's some things that we should be doing right now, your virtual garlic, so to speak. MFA, or a multi-factor authentication, to prevent unauthorized access. That second step of ID is important. Single sign-on gives you the opportunity to let your team log in from using one set of credentials to multiple applications, which helps you reduce that need to reuse passwords. Also, to help with that, we've got password managers that can help maintain those strong passwords without people having to remember a password. And then, of course, tried and true, use strong passwords. And we recommend easy to remember but difficult to guess passwords that are different, obviously, per account.
Yeah, okay. So that is sort of a little interesting, right? So passwords that are easy to remember and difficult to guess, but in the past, what we have recommended people use for passwords in my world is not easy to remember. So I think that something has changed. And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So for years, we've recommended that longer is better and to use I wanted to say complexity, but that's not a word. But we encourage the use of complexity, which means you're mixing characters in capital and non-capital letters and numbers and hashtags and all sorts of things. And often randomly generated passwords made their way in. But while longer passwords are more secure, they're harder to remember, and we're more likely to write them down somewhere. And depending on how long it is, there are technologies out there that can crack passwords. So NIST recommends that we use something that is more memorable than a randomly generated password, but it is longer. So let's say a passphrase, which is a 4 or more words grouped together and not to form a pretty sentence. They should be relatively random words, and to use it together to make a strong password. But don't worry about writing, feverishly writing down what I just said, because we're actually going to have a whole episode dedicated to password security later in like week 3 or 4 of our Halloween cybersecurity video series.
Yeah, and that'll be a really good one because we'll break this down. We'll show you some demonstrations and all the things to that effect. So keep an eye on our social feeds and your email because we'll be sending all of this to you shortly. But with that, that's all we have for today, folks. So we'll see you tomorrow.
See you then.